Hey everyone, welcome. Let me ask you something right off the bat. Have you seen headlines or videos lately talking about Trump and martial law? It might sound like something out of a movie, but it's actually becoming a real question some people are asking, especially with the direction things have been going lately. Ever since Donald Trump returned to the presidency earlier this year, a lot of people have started asking questions that used to feel unthinkable. And while that might raise some eyebrows, what's more surprising is that the conversation isn't just happening in internet comment sections or on fringe blogs. Legal scholars, journalists, and even some former government officials are weighing in, asking what it means when a president starts talking about using the military inside the United States. And what's interesting is that this concern isn't coming out of thin air. It's tied to an old law, over 200 years old actually, called the Insurrection Act, and it's still in effect today. Most people don't know much about it, but it gives a sitting president very broad powers under certain conditions. So what does all this mean for you? Could martial law really happen here? Or are these just rumors getting blown out of proportion? Let's take a closer look together and make sense of what's actually happening and what might just be political noise. And while we're here, if you like thoughtful and honest conversations about important issues, consider subscribing. It really helps, and I'd love to have you along for future discussions. So now, let's start with the basics. What is martial law? Well, martial law is when military authority temporarily replaces regular civil government. That could mean things like curfews, restrictions on movement, or using soldiers instead of local police. In extreme cases, it could even mean pausing civil liberties like the right to protest or be tried in a regular court. But here's the thing, it's not something we see often in the US. And that's a good thing. We have a strong tradition of civilian government, and martial law is considered a last resort. There's no single law that defines martial law in our country, but the authority to carry it out typically comes from something called the Insurrection Act. Now, the Insurrection Act has been around since 1807. It gives the president the ability to deploy the military within the US under specific circumstances, like putting down riots, helping with emergencies, or making sure federal laws are enforced when local officials can't or won't. It's been used before. In 1957, President Eisenhower used it to help integrate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush used it during the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict. In both cases, the goal was to restore public order during moments of chaos. So this isn't new. But what makes people nervous now is how and when that power might be used going forward. Now fast forward to January 2025. On Inauguration Day, President Trump signed an executive order declaring a national emergency at the southern border. The order also tasked two key officials, his Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Homeland Security, with reviewing whether it might be appropriate to use the Insurrection Act to control the situation. That report is due April 20th. On its own, that's a procedural step. Presidents often ask for reports or assessments like this. It doesn't mean anything will happen automatically. But when you zoom out and look at it alongside other things happening in the administration, that's when people start asking bigger questions. Like, what's the plan here? You see, Trump has been very vocal about wanting to take strong action on immigration. He's talked about mass deportations, ending birthright citizenship, and even sending the military to the border. When you pair that with this executive order, some people worry that it could lead to military force being used more broadly inside the US. On top of that, there were sudden leadership changes at the Pentagon. Several high-ranking legal officials in the military were replaced, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and top legal advisors. The new officials brought in are seen by some as more politically aligned with the president. Now, depending on your perspective, that could mean one of two things. Some believe it's a troubling sign, that the administration is surrounding itself with people who might not question or resist controversial orders. That's especially concerning if those orders involve military deployments on US soil. But others argue it's just standard politics. New presidents often bring in their own people. It happens with every administration, and having loyal cabinet members isn't unusual. Every president wants a team they can trust to carry out their policies. So then, is Trump really planning to declare martial law? Well, here's where it gets tricky. The term martial law is being used a lot online, especially on platforms like TikTok and X, but not always correctly. People often confuse martial law with strong immigration enforcement or emergency orders. They're not the same thing. What the administration appears to be doing right now is operating within legal boundaries, asking for a report, making personnel changes, signing executive orders that are technically allowed. So far, nothing crosses into martial law as it's traditionally understood. Still, it's the potential for where things could go that has people watching closely, especially if the Insurrection Act is used in a broad or unusual way. And that's where the concern comes in. The language in the law is vague. It says the president can act if unlawful obstruction makes it hard to enforce federal laws. That could be interpreted in different ways depending on who's in power. And critics say that kind of wiggle room opens the door for overreach. Supporters say the law is necessary to keep order when things break down. So it really comes down to how the power is used and whether it's being used fairly with checks and balances in place. And speaking of checks and balances, we still have them. The courts, Congress, and the press all play a role in holding power accountable. Just recently, for example, the Supreme Court ruled against efforts to disqualify Trump from running using the 14th Amendment. That shows the system is still working. Also, talk of a third term, something Trump has joked about, has been dismissed by many legal scholars as a non-starter. The 22nd Amendment clearly limits presidents to 2 terms. That's not just tradition, that's the law. So, while it's true that some actions from the administration are raising eyebrows, it's also true that there are limits in place. It's not just one person calling all the shots unchecked. At the same time, history teaches us that democracies don't usually fall apart in one day. It often happens slowly, through legal changes, small exceptions, or emergencies that seem justified in the moment. That's why it's so important to pay attention to how power is being used, not just what's written on paper. And here's a question worth thinking about. If we get too comfortable with the idea of military involvement in civilian life, does that change what democracy looks like over time? That's not just a left or right issue. It's a question for anyone who believes in balance, transparency, and keeping the government accountable, no matter who's in charge. So then what happens now? Well, the April 20th report could be just another routine step, or it could mark the beginning of a larger plan to shift how federal power is used, especially at the border. Either way, it's something to keep an eye on, calmly and carefully. No one's saying the sky is falling, but asking good questions, staying informed, and understanding the tools that government officials have. That's how we stay grounded. That's how we stay involved. If you found this helpful or thought-provoking, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Do you feel like the concerns around martial law are valid? Or do you think it's just internet panic? Let me know below. And again, if this kind of clear, balanced conversation is something you appreciate, consider subscribing. I always aim to keep it real, thoughtful, and grounded. Thanks for being here. Stay curious, stay calm, and I'll talk to you again soon.